For this particular topic, we're looking at the demographic breakdown. After the 2024 presidential election, we saw, I think, a lot of conversations now following the election is a lot of blame shifting, finger pointing, asking what went wrong, what went right on both different sides of parties. It appears that blacks, although black men kind of shifted a little bit towards Donald Trump, most of that voting demographic stayed pretty much with the Democratic Party. Then we start looking at other people of color and other demographics, and a lot of the conversation has now shifted to the Latino vote, which is a large margin broken down to, it seems like a lot of Latino men voted for Donald Trump, whereas a lot of Latino women favored Kamala Harris. This narrative or this uprising, what do you think, what has been the outcome within the Latino demographic following this 2024 presidential election?
Sure. So we polled more than 9,000 voters, so people who voted in the 2024 election that we all just experienced, and that included what we call oversamples. So big quantities of Latinos, of African Americans, of Asian Americans, Native Americans, and a very large sample of white voters as well. And I think what I'd start with is that people of color, including Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, voted quite strongly for Harris. We did see some, and white voters, both white men and white women, voted very strongly for Donald Trump. There's a small segment of white women, that's younger white women, who voted slightly towards Harris. So just a few points, almost 50-50, but just beyond 50-50 was support for Harris. So that was the one segment of the white community that voted for Harris. Otherwise, strong majorities of white women and white men voted for Donald Trump. And Harris's strategy was to do well among people of color, and then to do well with white women. The truth of the matter is that Democrats haven't won white women since Bill Clinton was a candidate, and haven't won white voters in total since Johnson was a candidate. So that strategy came close, but was not successful for Harris. Specific to so what we saw were a couple of things that played out in this election. One was that it looks like fewer people simply voted, and then among those who voted, white people were a somewhat higher percentage than they were 4 years ago. And so it wasn't just about what we call vote choice, who you chose to vote for, but who actually turned out, and who was inspired to come out and vote. And all of those things kind of work together. And so not only did white folks shift more towards Trump, but somewhat more of them came out relative to voters of color. Not as many white people or voters of color came out as they did 4 years ago in the Biden versus Trump election. But a slightly higher percentage came out of white voters relative to voters of color. We did see a shift, as you mentioned, a relatively small shift in the African American community, a shift towards Trump, but relatively small. A shift as well among Latinos and Asian Americans, but still they were largely Democratic voters, particularly in swing states. What I would say, though, and what isn't getting a lot of attention, is that for each of those groups, younger voters, so younger Black voters, younger Latino voters, younger Asian American voters, that they were not as supportive of Harris as older voters in those demographics. So we're spending a lot of time talking about men, but it's actually in some ways more interesting that younger voters of color, as opposed to men of color, that younger voters of color played such a role because that's actually where we see some of this shift. It's actually been happening for some time. Younger African American voters 4 years ago and 8 years ago were less likely to vote for the Democrat than their older peers, than maybe their black mother or their black grandfather. But that shift has continued. It's still the case, though, that even among young black men, 70% voted for Harris.
Got it. And so now we're looking kind of I think another thing that we've taken away is as younger voters are starting to shift towards the Republican Party, it seems like America is also learning a lesson that the Latino population is not a monolith. What has been the reaction or you all's reaction when it comes to that in particular, as far as what America thought the Latino population would bring out for the Democratic Party and what reality really is?
Yeah, so first, I think we should say that there's a geographic difference, right? And then there's a country of origin difference. And so what we see is that Latino voters in Florida, a majority of those Latino voters in Florida voted for Trump. When we look at other states, a majority voted for Harris, right? So we're not seeing the kind of big shift where we're actually seeing outside of Florida that Latinos are now voting for the Democratic Party. But what we do see across all groups is that policies that we associate with the Democratic Party, abortion rights, allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices on behalf of the American people, climate change issues. So these issues are very popular among Americans of all stripes. Abortion has supporting abortion rights is about 70% support and has support across all groups. But that hasn't translated into support, that high levels of support for Democratic candidates. So policies that Democrats are known to champion are much more popular than Democratic candidates. And there may be no better example of this than the state of Missouri. So in Missouri, Josh Hawley, who's really a MAGA senator, was up for election. Trump was obviously up for election. Trump and Hawley, Senator Hawley, both won easily. They are, like I said, they're MAGA candidates. They won easily. In that same election, there were a set of ballot initiatives. One was to protect abortion rights. So there was an anti-abortion law in Missouri. The voters voted for Trump, voted for Hawley, voted to protect abortion rights and get rid of that anti-abortion focused law. They also voted for, in a ballot initiative, to support paid sick leave, and they voted to increase their minimum wage to $15 an hour. That's really striking, right? That we see this in state after state, that progressive ideas, progressive policies are doing better than Democratic candidates. And I think this goes to two things. One is that the Democratic Party probably needs to do some work so that people understand how strongly tied they are to these policies. But two, I think it also goes to how powerful the economy and particularly the cost of living was in motivating particularly white voters to vote for Donald Trump. That we see there's a strong correlation for white voters, not really so much for voters of color, but a strong correlation for white voters that if the economy, particularly the cost of living, was their number one issue, then they were very highly likely to vote for Trump. And so this cost of living and economy issue was a driving force and overcame a number of these very popular issues for voters that are associated typically with the Democratic Party.
For sure. I would say another good example is North Carolina. I think North
Absolutely.
Carolina had multiple Democrats who won at their local government and then still
Including
voted
for governor. Yeah,
governor and still voted. And I think lieutenant governor and still voted
that's right.
for Donald Trump as the president. So that's interesting. Looking at what's next, right? Well, also I want to ask you, we've looked at inflation, we've looked at the voter breakdown, society, America's, everybody's kind of pointing fingers right now, figuring out what's going on, what's going to happen, and then also kind of accepting the results of this election. So I do want to ask or phrase the question though, is it possible that based on despite inflation, economy, we're seeing people still vote for progressive rights, that maybe it could have been race and gender that also could have defeated Harris in this presidential election?
So that's a really interesting question. We asked it in our poll because we wanted to know. And what we found was that for voters of color that voted for Trump, they actually said that Harris' gender really was not a part of their decision making. But a significant number of white male voters said that voted for Trump said that her gender was part of their decision making. And so I think based on that question and their answers, that it looks like, particularly for that group of men that were Trump voters, that it may have made a difference. I do think many of them probably would have voted for the Republican candidate even if there had been a man on the ticket. But this was still a very close race, and we think that when it's all said and done, that in the popular vote, Trump may win by about a half a point. That's how close this race was. So I think we've now had two highly qualified women run for president. In both cases, they lost, and so America still, unlike many other leading countries in the world, America still has not elected a woman, despite having multiple strong candidates now who are women.
And Henry, the follow-up question is coming. What is it going to take for the country to possibly see a woman candidate lead America?
That's a great question. I think it's one that America is going to have to struggle with, right? And really come to grips with. And a part of it, I do think, will be that there have to be candidates who lose, but they're the ones that hit that glass ceiling the first time, and then they hit it a second time even harder, and then there'll be someone who breaks through. I'm quite a bit older than you, Jade, and so when I was a young person in high school, I remember Jesse Jackson running for president. I went to a predominantly black high school, but still with a lot of white students. And it was a huge deal for us that he ran, but none of us thought Jesse Jackson was going to win because we didn't think, frankly, that the country was ready for that. And I think for people in my generation and the generation before mine, when Barack Obama ran, we were very excited and we worked for him and we volunteered. We went to rallies. But for most of us, we didn't think he would win. Like if you talk to your parents or grandparents about it, they may admit that. But then he did, right? And we worked hard, even though we thought it was unlikely. But younger people who had not had our experiences throughout our lives, they believed he could win. And then ultimately he did. And so I think America is going to face some very difficult times over the next 4 years, and our divisions are going to be highlighted. They're going to be exacerbated. I don't think there's any question that however one voted, I think we all have to acknowledge that Trump's vision for America is that there's some people who deserve to be here and some who don't. And that's going to create real ongoing tensions in the country. And it may be that Americans learn from that and push back. But in the same way that Obama broke through that glass ceiling, but there were a lot of people who came first who banged up against it and made it a little weaker. I think that Hillary Clinton, Vice President Harris have banged up against it, made it a little weaker, and will make it easier for Americans to envision that a woman could be president. And for that, I think we owe Vice President Harris a debt of great gratitude as Americans. And I certainly hope that this will be something that I'll see in my lifetime.